Um, cool. Well, we're going to get into the first of one of two GRC talks. Again, there's kind of a theme.
Mhm.
So Cam is going to be talking about GRC is for everyone, and as someone, I will bring her on first so
Yep.
she can hear the wonderful things I have to say. Hello, Cam.
Hello.
It's
Hello,
lovely
everybody.
to see you again. Cam, by the way, is the person that gave the presentation a couple of years ago on RFC jokes, the joke RFCs. Amazing talk. Love that talk. HTTP over avian character. Oh no, TCP. I can't remember. Over avian character. Carrier
Pigeons.
was the pigeons. Yeah. So I will say GRC is a space that I have not really played in very often because I'm not going to use the word technical, but I'm more like doing this thing over here and GRC is over here. However, I will say, as someone who recently had to do 9 months and then do an IRAP assessment, I never want to do that shit ever again. So GRC people are very important, and Cam is going to talk to us about what they are like in Australia. Go for it, Cam.
Thank you very much. I do have a trigger warning. You may see some spreadsheets that may look familiar. So let's get started. So this talk is basically for focusing on very much at the beginner level and just with a bit of different framing on how you can actually look at GRC, even though you may not actually consider it part of your role or part of your title. There's definitely a lot of nuances involved with it, and you'll find that even though you don't practice it every day, you might actually be a lot more involved than you think. So first of all, we'll get started, and I'll start off with a story about a breach. So this particular breach, a person did a thing. A developer decided they would go and make things really efficient by pushing a bit of code. That bit of code actually did a few things, and a few things happened. So we had this particular piece of code that was pushed, and then a few customers on a particular website that this code was related to noticed that when they were typing in their details onto a booking form, that if they left it for a while and then came back, it wasn't their name in the name field anymore. It wasn't their email address or their phone number or even their dietary requirements or their special needs. It turned out someone else's detail had popped up on the screen. Now, like any inquisitive user, someone decided to actually make a call. They went and took a number that was published on that particular website, on that particular screen, decided to give it a call. And they actually ran into another customer and managed to get in contact with them and check their details and actually figured out that, oh, I did in fact get the information about somebody else. So this particular person actually went and reported it to the organization whose website they were booking on. And that was 9 days later. So it turned out data was spilled. Information that they shouldn't have seen actually ended up appearing on someone else's view, on someone else's version of the website. These people were in completely different locations, in completely different geographical regions, but they could see each other's data. So what does that actually mean? It's an incident. You call up your team, you figure out what's going on, why it's happened, and sometimes you get third-party people. You get someone else to come and give you a hand and figure out what the hell has just happened and why and who. So naturally, this came at Friday, 4:30 p.m. in the middle of spring, and there goes a weekend trying to figure out what's happened, who's involved, how much information has actually leaked out over a period of 9 days. And in this case, with over 16 million web requests over that time to understand basically who was involved and who was impacted. With something like this, you see lawyers involved. Once you know that data's out, that's when the big guns come out, trying to figure out what's the risk to the organization, what's the risk to the business, how much information is leaked, and do I actually need to go and and escalate things further. In this case, people were seriously harmed. Now, seriously harmed is a very specific word in a very specific piece of legislation. It's also quite an ambiguous term when you're trying to figure out what is the impact and how is it and who is actually impacted. In this case, it was to the point where a particular government body needed to be notified of this, what is essentially a data breach. So in the cleanup and figuring out what's happened, what's gone wrong, we then need to tell the impacted people that yes, their data's gone out and what's the risk to them. Luckily, in this case, it turns out we only had about 100 people out of a potential 16 million that needed to have this information reported. So this is what a typical breach may look like, but what does this have to do with GRC? Well, the end of the cycle is you'll end up seeing it in something like this. So this is a notifiable data breach report collated by the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, so or also known as the OAIC. They are the governing body to deal with privacy in Australia, and they are the organisation that any company of a particular size will then go and report data breaches or things that have happened to their organisation with customers or other people's data. In this particular case, this particular story or the particular issue was actually a system fault. But system faults only make 3% of the potential breaches, in this case, in the 6 months to December 2023. You'll see that quite a large proportion are malicious attacks or criminal attacks, so your typical ransomware, scams and the like. But there's actually a good proportion where it's actually related to human error. You'll be quite surprised about the breakup of what constitutes sort of the top human error breaches. PII sent to the wrong email recipient. Unauthorized disclosure or unintended release of their information. What's surprising is number 3, which is PII sent to the wrong recipient via mail. So you're not only just seeing the crossover from the electronic side of things, but in the physical realm as well. It's actually quite interesting. Last year, the same stats, BCC to the wrong recipient was actually number 3. So we've actually seen a change in the last couple of years. What you'll actually find is breaches actually, the distribution of breaches actually impact people, not how you may necessarily expect it to. In this case, you've got 137 instances where only one person was impacted by a breach, but it still needed to be reported. If you look further down, 2 to 10, 11 to 100, so the first 1,000, they're all fairly large numbers, but in the scheme of things, fairly small quantities. But what we have seen, especially recently, is sort of that big shift towards large numbers of people impacted and large number of Australians impacted. So we have quite a few sitting there in the in the million, 10 million category and above 10 million, which definitely relates to some of the breaches that we've seen quite recently in the last year. All right. So we talked a little bit about data breaches. We'll sort of tie it back and sort of why it matters. So who am I? I'm Cam. I like tea. You'll typically see me talk about tea, whether it's in RFCs or in other means. I like a lot of stuff, and I know a lot of stuff about a lot of stuff. You'll typically find me solving challenges, tech or otherwise, and I have a habit of picking quite a few hats and a ridiculous number of skills along the way. In recent years, you would have seen me running around as a forensic investigator, working on IR, doing a bit more of sort of the incident side of things. But every every couple of months, I'd be involved in things like ISO audits, helping to uplift and prepare organizations for for compliance checks. And every couple of years, I get involved in reading spreadsheets like these. Yes, that is 800 plus rows in those particular spreadsheets. Anyone that has looked at ISM or IRAP will be quite familiar with these things. And this is what the typical sort of stereotype with GRC looks like. When people think about GRC, they think about spreadsheets. They think about really, really long lists of things and a whole bunch of checkboxes. But here's the thing. GRC is actually more than just spreadsheets and checkboxes. But what I'll be doing is going through about why that is. Before we get to that though, let's go back to the beginning and talk about what is GRC. So governance, risk, compliance. You can go and basically break it down into a few easy sort of simple questions to think about. Governance, in the sort of when you're looking at it as an organization, how do I want my organization to run? How do I want to sort of direct it? How do I want to oversee it? What are the things or what are sort of the ways that I want that organization to operate? Risk. What is going to cause me problems? What is going to sink my ship today? How can I manage it? What are the things that I can put in place? And how can I reduce that risk to my organization? And then compliance. How do I validate whatever I put down as far as trying to manage my risk actually works? How can I test it? How can I make sure that that all those controls, all those sort of methods and means that I've decided to put in will actually do what it's supposed to do? Some of these may sound familiar. You may hear about a little bit about something like pen testing. Doesn't that sound a little bit like compliance? Sort of risk and how do I manage it? How do I manage it? How do I build something? How do I actually architect and create an environment where I can actually go and protect that information? That sounds an awful lot like security architecture. And then governance, what are sort of the policies in place? What are the processes in place? How do I actually go about doing these things? Which sort of veers more into your sort of traditional GRC. With that particular data breach that I spoke of at the beginning, everything to get to the point where you could actually go and notify the relevant government body within the prescripted timeframes, which is 30 days. You need to have your policies in place. You need to have all your things in place. You need to have the people in place to be able to go understand what you have, what the issue is, be able to solve it, and be able to report and understand enough about the risk that's happening to your business. So all of these things actually tie in to your incident response plans, your architecture plans, and the like. So who needs GRCs? We've talked a lot about organizations and sort of how that comes together. But it's not just organizations. It's also groups as well. Groups like your users, your stakeholders, people who actually may not even be involved with your organization, but are impacted by it. And then you've got the individual people. These might be the people on the ground that are actually doing the work. These might be the people that are making decisions. Now, you'll actually find that these may not be the same people, this may not be the same organizations, or you may be dealing with technical or non-technical people. So how do you communicate between the two when you've got different ideas of how things work? Turns out GRC is really helpful for that. GRC is actually a really good way of communicating between people, organizations. You can use it as a common language to talk about security between technical and non-technical people. And that common language is talking about risk. So What you'll find though is when you're looking at GRC, there's actually different ways and that risk or sort of is applied based on different what we call standards or controls. So different ways of applying it. So here are just two examples from some of the most common risk frameworks that you'll see out in the wild. On the left-hand side, you'll see something from ISO 27001. In this case, we're talking about passwords. On the right-hand side, you'll see something from the ISM, the ASD Information Security Manual. So ISO 27001, they're both talking about passwords. So on the left, password management systems shall be interactive and shall ensure quality passwords. You'll notice this language is quite suggestive. Doesn't tell you exactly how you implement it, but gives you a broad sort of topic area or sort of focus area to basically go and improve your security. You do have more prescriptive controls like the ISM, which tell you how you should do it. Passphrases used for single-factor authentication are not a list of categorized words, don't form a real sentence, not made of song lyrics, movies, literature, or any other publicly available material. So all of these phrases, all of these words, they help provide a common way that we can actually go and approach different topic areas with security and use that to speak to other people in the business. So what you'll actually find is sort of taking GRC as a whole, it's a measurable way to help maintain and improve the overall security of an organization. But how do we do that? It's through this thing called standards. So what are standards? Standards are a family of sort of different things that basically help you sort of define and understand and apply security. So you'll see this quite commonly: guidelines, frameworks, standards. Guidelines, these are the recommendations on what you can do to improve your security. Frameworks, here's a way that you can actually apply those general recommendations to your security posture. And standards, here are some explicit things that you should do to go and apply security into your organization. So in Australia, we actually have quite a few standards and frameworks that you'll commonly see used depending on sort of the scope of the organization. Quite common, especially in the corporate space, is ISO 27001, Information Security Management Systems. If you're working in government, then you'll tend to see a few more Australian-based compliance standards, things like Essential 8, the ISM. You might even see state-based ones like the Victorian Protective Data Security Framework. All of these are different ways that you can apply security, different ways that you can help basically protect organizations or businesses. Some of them will be directly relevant depending on the type of organization you are, the type of information you're dealing with, sort of what area you're focusing on. But what we'll actually do is we'll go into a bit of a deep dive into ISO 27001 and sort of tie in some of the information that, especially for those sort of learning about security now, you'll actually find there's some overlaps that you wouldn't expect. So let's jump into it. CIA, the Information Security Triad. The basic building blocks of what we constitute as security today: confidentiality. How do I make sure my data remains how do I make sure that my data remains available to only the people that I want it to be? Integrity. How do I know that it hasn't changed along the way? Availability. How do I make sure that the people that I want to get it to actually do get it? Well, it actually turns out this actually forms part of the ISM. ISO 27001. So this is actually a description of what ISO 27001 does. It's an information security management system that preserves the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. But it does it through risk management. So, and that risk management is then there to give confidence to interested parties. So we're communicating that risk and making sure that that risk is adequately managed. So this is what this particular standard is doing. And it uses the information that and the basic building blocks and tenets that you would have learned throughout in security. How do you do it? Provide requirements for establishing, implementing, maintaining, and continually improving an information security management system. Establishing. Now, that doesn't just sound like someone working in GRC. That sounds like someone who might be there actually creating and building up the system. Might be someone who's an architect. You might have someone implementing that architect is then actually developing and deploying that system. Maintaining. That's your SecOps team. Those are your incident responders. Those are your pen testers. Those are all the people there that are making sure they're keeping the lights on. And continuously improving. It's that cycle of doing that again and again to make sure you go and uplift the security posture of information security system. So you, wherever you are in your role, you actually are helping with GRC. You are there helping to build the systems, build the organization, and helping to uplift that organization to make sure that it goes and improves its security posture. But there is actually a limitation to compliance. Now, we're all aware of some recent data breaches that have happened in the last 12 months. Here's an example of a particular organization that is accredited to ISO 27001 on a particular location in a particular data center in Sydney. So this particular excerpt is from 2008, so quite outdated now, but it is actually publicly available. However, one of the issues you'll find is scoping of these systems and of these standards, and that actually is where you see a lot of the gaps appear. We all know that the Optus breach had to deal with an unauthenticated test environment and an API that was made available. None of this would have been covered as far as this particular set of ISO controls or this particular standard being applied to that. It wouldn't have picked that up. And understanding the scoping and being able to understand that, yes, it's there. Having it there is assurance, but it's not going to protect you. So it's part of a layered system that will help. So what are some examples of some of the policies and the governing bodies in Australia and sort of the legal side of things and how that applies? We actually have quite a few sort of different bodies, regulators and organisations that help to deal with compliance in Australia. So on the international side, you'll see ISO, which develop the ISO 27001 standard. NIST is there, though you'll find that most Australian organisations deal with ISO as far as adhering to a particular standard or certification. Then you have quite a few Australian organisations like the OAIC, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, and we even have corporate regulators in there, so ASIC as well as APRA as some examples of government organisations that are actually there to help ensure that organisations are applying cybersecurity to cybersecurity and reducing the risk there. We've actually got quite a few bits of legislation that apply depending on where you are and what your organization does. If you're international, GDPR will generally apply to anybody that has information on citizens from the EU. But in Australia, you've got the Privacy Act and the Notifiable Data Breaches Amendment, which is covered by the OAIC. If you're part of critical infrastructure, you've got another act that applies to you. And I believe there is over 20 different industries that is now covered by that. And that has different rules about when you have to notify about potential breaches in data. If you're a government organization in the last 3 or 4 years, the PSPF, or the Protective Security Framework, governs sort of your minimum standards, and that in that case it involves adhering to Essential 8. If you're a financial institution, one of the more recent ones that you'd be looking at is CPS 234, and how you apply information security to your organization so that you can actually go and adhere to that particular standard. So these particular pieces of legislation, in combination with the governing bodies, help to apply basically a carrot and stick effect to corporate organizations to help them basically go and improve their security. But there are limitations to it. So in this case, the Privacy Act, which covers notifiable data breaches, currently only covers organizations with an annual turnover of more than $3 million. That doesn't cover your small businesses, your real estate agents, anybody that may have a lot of personal information. They're not sort of held to the same standards as a large corporation. So this has been picked up. We do have the Privacy Act review that was released last year. It does help in some respects. It's not as good as some of the other privacy legislation that you do see across internationally, but it is a step up from where we are. So how does this all come together at the end? So things to think about. How do you know what applies to you, or what may apply to your organization or where you work? Are you a public or private sector? How big is your company? Are you working in federal or state gov? Are you working in critical industry or not, or something that's regulated? And the key other thing to think about is, where are you applying GRC? Is it organizational wide? Is it system wide? So coming back to it, remember that these systems require people to establish, implement, maintain, and continuously improve. Those are the people on the ground. Those are the people that are actually doing the work. It's not just people sitting there building checkboxes, ticking boxes, making sure things work. The whole point of a lot of these systems and all of these processes is that continuous improvement, to be able to see that things get better, things actually work, and that we're not just sitting there idle, that we're continually pushing the bar up. And the most important thing that's required to do that is you, the people. So it turns out everybody has a part to play in GRC and risk. So key takeaways. GRC is actually more than just spreadsheets and checkboxes. It's a measurable way to maintain and improve security of organizations, and everybody has a part to play. Thank you.
Which is better, risk or compliance? I'm not trying to trigger Alan at all.
That is definitely a tricky question.
Maybe it's a trick question.
That is true.
There's only one answer.
You can refuse to answer. It's fine. I think that was a really good talk and a really good introduction to a lot of people. There's been a lot of discussion about controls and what are the real standards and tailoring and what could we have done. So I think it's a good point to always consider that cyber is a team sport and GRC is part of that team. Like, it doesn't matter what you're doing. Oh God, stop beeping at me. It doesn't matter what you're doing. There's a whole bunch of like standards policies, and then eventually it leads to regulations and laws, and we need to track all those things through. Not triggered. Alan says he's not triggered. We need to try harder. So
Lying, Alan. We know
yeah,
you're triggered.
we know he's triggered.
Just by the fact that you said you're not triggered shows that you're triggered.
Spreadsheets suck, Alan.
Now he's just being silly.
Anyway, the point I was making was GRC is very important. I know a lot of people shit on GRC people, and we don't do that here. That's very important. But like, it is a very important point of making sure that things are done securely. So thank you very much for that talk. It was really good.
Thank you.
No worries.